Welcome everyone to today's webinar on Transactional KYC Compliance and Solutions. Now, I'd like to introduce our host for the day, our Director of Investment Management Solutions of Lawson Conner, Joe Woodbury. Just bear in mind, before Joe begins, if you have any questions, please enter your questions into the question box and we'll do our best to answer all of them. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining. Joe Woodbury is my name. I'm one of the directors here at Lawson Conner on the investment management practice, and I'm joined here by Andrew Shrimpton. Andrew has extensive experience. I'm sure he won't mind me describing him as a veteran, but I'm going to because he has a lot of experience from a variety of different very prominent firms, as well as having spent time at the FCA as well. Good afternoon, Andrew.
Good afternoon to everyone.
Thank you very much. So it's been a very, very busy couple of years, actually. We're going to just begin by setting the scene, I think, is quite important, because what's gone on in the last couple of years has fed directly into our business here at Lawson Conner. We have begun seeing more and more inquiries come from clients who are looking for help around dealing with their regulatory and compliance obligations. Traditionally, we have focused a lot more in the regulatory infrastructure space, but we are working more and more with firms that are dealing with increasingly regulatory hurdles that they are trying to meet. And here we just see some of what's gone on in the last few years. We'll come on to talk more about 4MLLD, Andrew, today. But I think there's been a growing focus here, moving away from not just the larger firms, but also the smaller firms as well. GDPR, we're all aware of. PRIPS is also a new regulation that's come into force this year. We actually had a webinar on this last week as well, which we'll be very happy to share afterwards for anyone that requires. Just let me know. Okay, here's our agenda for today. So we're going to begin by looking at what is the risk, or what is the risk of non-compliance for smaller firms, and why it is actually difficult for smaller firms to implement an adequate AML and KYC process. We're going to look at what framework the JMLSG guidelines say about what firms should be doing, the role that technology can play in this day and age, working examples of how we work with clients, and how also to deal with some particular high risk and enhanced due diligence scenarios. And as we've heard as well, if you've got any questions, just please ask them and we'll try and get through them today. Okay? So now, a lot of you will be aware, I'm sure, of some of the recent scandals which have hit the headlines recently. Danske, the ethical, clean Nordic bank, not to pick on them too much, but have been in the headlines for all the wrong reasons recently, as have Goldman Sachs with the 1MDB scandal. Now, Andrew, it's not just the larger firms, is it, that the FCA are focused on? Smaller and middle-sized firms are becoming more in scope, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. In this area, AML, KYC, the FCA do regular sweeps or thematic reviews, which has a cross-section of firms. So it includes smaller firms, and usually, and these happen almost annually, I'd say, there are a couple of private equity managers involved, deliberately because they want the sample. And they have to do this because the FATF, which are the sort of global standard setter, they also assess regulators and countries. And, so they actually regulate the regulator, as it were, and they don't like the FCA's risk-based approach and desk-type analysis. They want to see them doing visits. So, in this particular area, PE firms will get caught from time to time in thematic reviews, and also, and it's a bit like the market abuse area, there are suspicious activity reports are put in, so your name might come up in one of those. Yeah. And there might be a specific case on a specific investor or specific investment where, just your KYC on that particular investment is looked at. So there is some jeopardy there. Okay. Of the FCA looking at what you do.
And do you think it's adequate for people to say that they follow a risk-based approach? Is that an acceptable approach under the FCA's guidance?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, where people usually fall over is that they don't have the files and the records to back up what they're doing.
Right.
So really,
they've got to have evidence of that.
Yeah, I mean, if the FCA contacts you about a specific example and want to see your KYC, they'll ask for the file.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks very much. And moving on, so I've got a quote here which I think captures quite well the situation that we see a lot with our clients, and as well what we hear a lot in the industry, that too many firms are still using outdated 20th century processes to meet complex 21st century legislation. As we'll come on to see today, there is a big opportunity around this particular area for underlying transactional KYC. There's an opportunity for firms to better standardize processes, improve performance, bring about automation. We won't focus too much on AI and certainly not blockchain today, but they are very prominent topics and they are going to be key drivers in this space in the future. But certainly the firms that we've worked with before have been able to maintain their ability to keep up with growing regulations without necessarily having to grow their teams. And they've been able to bring about cost and resource reductions by as much as 50 to 80% in some cases. So we'll come on to look at this in more detail. Now, Andrew, I know that this is something that you wanted to talk about a little bit more detail. This is the JMLSG guidelines. So could you perhaps walk us through this framework in a bit more detail? Because I understand this is really one of the only frameworks that exists for what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's sort of widely appreciated. I mean, these guidelines are produced by trade bodies, including the BVCA is part of it. They're endorsed by the FCA, so you know they're as good as kind of statutory regulations in many ways. They're very practical. So there's a chapter on CDD which goes through all the different type of legal structures and risk levels. And private equity, in the second part of it, the sectorial part, private equity has its very own chapter, chapter 13, and which gives a load of practical guidance on what you do. And it splits out between investor KYC when you're fundraising as a private equity manager and investments KYC, transactional KYC we're talking about today, where you're making investment.
So Andrew, if I may, just talk us through, let's take a step back, what does a private equity firm do about trying to create a successful DD framework for transactional compliance? Where do you begin?
Well, I think you look at chapter 13 and make sure you understand that. That's a big help. And there's two parts to it. You have to do a risk assessment first and then verification. So, but the form of the risk assessment is very prescribed. So you have to identify medium, low, and high risk, and then that links, and we'll come on to the actual steps in the next slide, to standard, simplified, and enhanced due diligence. So you actually have to demonstrate a risk-based approach and also document that you've taken a risk-based approach. It's not optional, a risk-based approach is kind of mandatory. I mean, most portfolio company investments will be unlisted companies, so, you know, that's why it's private equity. So they will be, for example, medium risk and subject to standard due diligence. Okay.
I brought up this slide, which I know you mentioned just a moment ago. Can you maybe just talk us through perhaps some obvious examples about how firms should interpret the interaction between things like a business sector, jurisdictional risk, governance risk? Are there things that supersede one another in this process and that would automatically trump something up to high enhanced due diligence? Maybe you could just walk us through that, Andrew.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the scenario here, the investment team has said we want to buy this firm, you know, likely to be an unlisted firm. They'll come to compliance and say we need the KYC. They often seem to leave this right till the last minute. They want it done very quickly. So the first step is that you have to risk assess the portfolio company. And in the guidance, it said these are the type of factors to consider when you're risk assessing the portfolio company. Firstly, business sector risk. I mean, is it in the business sector? I mean, where money laundering is more likely to be an issue. I mean, one example that's given is casinos, bookmakers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, slightly higher risk, aren't they?
Yeah, more regulated sectors, maybe lower risk, but you know, the investment team's done lots of due diligence, so they should really understand the business sector and have a view on what is the risk of money laundering in that sector. There's jurisdictional risk, so that is, where is the company based? Where does it do business? So there's certain jurisdictions that are high risk. You know, for example, Iran, North Korea, they're sanctioned at the highest risk. And then if you the EU and FATF actually put out lists of higher risk jurisdictions. And then the final one is what we call governance risk. In this scenario, for a portfolio company, it means, are one of the directors or one of the investors in the company a politically exposed person?
Okay.
So that's what to look out for.
Now, what's I was going to ask you on this slide, what's the most common way that firms fall over, Andrew?
Well, 80% of the time, the problem is that they don't have the records and the output from the process. So, you know, the FCA will be looking at a case. You might have invested in this firm. There's a scandal around it, so they'll contact you and say, provide us with your KYC AML file. If you don't have everything documented in that file, even if you've done all the right things, if you haven't got the documents, you can't produce it to the FCA.
Well, someone could have left the firm, right? And this could be 2 years on, and the FCA is saying, right, there's this particular case. It happened on January the 5th, 2016. Can we see where that decision was made, who it was made by, what evidence it was made by, what were the records that you got from the publicly available news sources? You really need to have this actionable, don't you, at a later stage? Yeah,
absolutely. And you find firms, you know, they made the investment 5 years ago, and the file's gone off to Iron Mountain somewhere in the car. And the FCA or the SFO, if they're involved, they'll want it within 48 hours. And if you can't produce it in 48 hours, they start getting suspicious. You've got to have all this stuff. You've got to document your risk assessment. Why did you choose? It was, you know, high, medium, or low. Part of the risk assessment is getting these AML, getting news sources and Google. You've got the AML screening records you've got to have there. You know, it might be World Check, for example. That's all documenting and justifying your risk assessment. And then you've got the verification documents, which are going to depend on your risk assessment. So for a typical listed investor, you know, you'll need structure charts, you'll need passport and utility bills for individual beneficial owners as a minimum. And we'll talk later about what you need to do with the actual other investors that aren't individual beneficial owners.
Okay, very good. Thanks very much, Andrew. Now, just a sort of small sales aside, and I'm sure you were perhaps expecting this, everyone joining on the webinar, just to introduce MaxComply, our AML software. This is something that we've developed internally, driven by customer demands, and it is very much a workflow-based system designed to capture some of the case management and AML tasks and KYC tasks that we've talked about today. So it deals with a better audit trail, better automation, having a better record keeping, and this is available either for our clients to manage and use themselves, or to actually use our personnel and to be doing some of that processing. But this allows even smaller and medium-sized firms to better handle some of these issues we're talking about without necessarily having to employ more compliance staff. So Andrew, this feeds into exactly what we're talking about, record keeping, audit trail, records of risk assessment, for instance.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a challenge of archiving. 80% of the time, the firms have done KYC properly, but they haven't kept the records properly. It's only about 20% of the time that they don't do the KYC properly.
Yeah. I wanted to touch upon here, Andrew, because I think it ties in nicely what you were talking about earlier. This process that when a company has actually been identified as being a target company, and the investment team's done their due diligence on them. They say, right, now we want to pull the trigger. We have to really put this in context, because often it is the investment team that's responsible for this, isn't it? And it is something that comes at the 11th hour. It's something that is part of a long list of other tasks that they have to complete. And this is actually what happens when that trigger is pulled. And you can see an example here of how our client would have engaged us before, and some of the steps that would then be taken. And we touched upon some of those things earlier. So understanding what the appropriate AML screening checks are, the Lawson Conner compliance team in this case providing a checklist of verification documents that's required. Those are uploaded by the counterparties, by the underlying target company, for instance, for Lawson Conner to review. And then once completed, there is clearly a management report generated that confirms the KYC has been followed and adhered to. So I just wanted to touch upon that as a brief example. Now, to actually move on here, what does this AML KYC compliance software MaxComply actually look like? What do we mean by software in relation to AML? Now, as I've mentioned before, this is a workflow-based system. So this is very customizable, and we've seen this used in a variety of different instances. This could be for a private equity fundraising, when someone's actually wanting to onboard their own investors. Similarly, as we're talking about today, this is in the context of an underlying target company. So here, the first step is, as we talked about, to identify what the tasks are that need to be completed. So based on the risk assessment, which Andrew touched upon earlier, simplified, standard, or enhanced, there have been a list of documents that have been generated here by our compliance team to be completed by the underlying portfolio company and the relevant counterparties. So straightforward things such as a certificate of incorporation could be uploaded into this central part of the system. There are other methodologies as well, as we'll come on to see. There are things like PEPs, sanctions, adverse media, which will be completed in-house using our own personnel. So there's clearly a big advantage here, isn't there, Andrew, by putting this all into one space, allowing it to be outsourced, allowing better automation.
Yeah, and documenting the risk assessment is key, and that's something that the Fourth Money Laundering Directive very much emphasised, and I think it's something that the industry sometimes doesn't quite get this distinction between you have to do the risk assessment first and then you determine what verification documents you need. I get a lot of queries from people saying, look, what verification documents do I need? What verification documents do I need? And I have to say, no,
take a step back.
Yeah, take a step back, do your risk assessment first, and then you'll be able to answer that question. And the Fourth Money Laundering Directive, where people fall down a lot, is that they don't document that risk assessment.
Yeah, and I'm sure
they only just keep the verification documents. Yeah, that is a key way in which you can fail.
And we're the Fourth Money Laundering Directive has really only just come into force, and there's probably a lot of people that aren't really aware of what its simple interpretation is. And it is, as you said, it's about risk assessment and it's about record keeping. Okay, very good. Just moving on to a slide. After the external tasks have been completed, after the documents have been provided, there is an internal review that then takes place. And as I say, some of this is supplemented by checks with things like WorldCheck and CreditSafe or Dow Jones. The system can be integrated into third-party data sources, but here you're seeing that there's some target company information. So what's the description of the company? Are they subject to regulatory supervision? And we're here documenting how the risk assessment has been approached, and we're walking through individual points under a risk assessment to make sure that this has all been documented and there is record of this. But it is very much a case-by-case process. It can differ from one client to another. Now, the outcome and output of this is that you want to have something that says, yes, great, done and dusted, this has been signed off, this has been approved, the risk assessment and the KYC has been completed. So there will be a full audit trail here which says who has actually signed off on this. Was it someone from the Lawson Conner compliance team, or was it the private equity firm's general counsel or head of compliance? This is auditable and it is retrievable at a later stage in case the head of legal or general counsel leaves. Someone can just log into the system and it's all there. You don't have to go sifting through emails. And that's actually an important point because there's a lot of sensitive documents as well that often are involved in these KYC processes. So around GDPR, cyber security risk, you really need these in a controlled space.
Yeah, if you're talking about a passport, I mean, there isn't a more GDPR sensitive document, I don't think, than a passport.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is typically PDF'd and it's an attachment to an email. So the current standard practice in the industry is really taking a lot of cyber security risk and a lot of risk with handling private personal data. Really.
Yeah, firms really having to pay attention in light of GDPR.
Yeah.
That's right. So this is a final management report that you would then receive, or one of our clients would receive, to say, look, this was the name of the firm, this was the due diligence that was completed, and clearly these are just snapshots. It's a lot more in depth than this. But this is really the output that you want to get to. So there's a record on file that this has been completed and signed off. And just to really summarize some of the things we've been talking about here, so there is an opportunity here to do more with less, which is a common theme across the industry that we've been seeing over the last few years. It highlights the ability to have a better audit trail, full case management, report generation. We touched upon security and sensitivity of important documents, and its complete flexibility as well. So this is just a sort of nice summary slide that ties together everything we've been talking about in terms of automation and software, the benefits that can be generated. Andrew, I think you were just kindly going to walk us through some examples of different approaches for different cases. So here we have one of unlisted companies. This is probably the most common, would you say? Could you maybe just walk us through?
Yeah, I mean, 90% of the time, something like that might be higher, private equity manager is going to be investing in unlisted
in an unlisted company. Yeah.
There are buyouts, for example, when you take something from a listed market, but they're less frequent. I think this is more standard. That's what private equity is about. So right at the beginning, for an unlisted company, you need quite a lot of information just to begin to do the risk assessment. So there's things that are obviously like the applicant name and registered address. You need the certificate of incorporation, memorandum, those kind of things. Importantly, you do need a register of the directors and also a register of the shareholders, which is where the challenge is. So you do need to know. Now, for a portfolio company in this scenario, there's loads of due diligence being done by the investment team. So all this information will be there, but I think they don't always think this information is relevant to the KYC. So I think it's a question of making the investment team aware of what in all their big data room and all this due diligence they've done, they need to deliver to the KYC provider or the KYC team, what bits of that they need to deliver. So that's a list there of what they need to deliver to the KYC team to get the whole process going.
Okay, fantastic. Very good. So that's the most common scenario. And then the flip side of that.
Yeah, the hard bit with unlisted companies is that the PE manager is buying that firm, so it's paying out money to a group of investors who are selling. Now, and again, this is not widely understood. I find some firms understood it, some don't. The guidance in Chapter 13 says that you do have to identify and take a risk assessment of every single seller.
Okay.
So, and this can be a problem because you might have 40 investors in this unlisted.
Yeah, or Baroness so-and-so that hasn't been in touch with the company for a number of years.
Yeah. So it might be a company that was founded 3 generations ago, and all these trusts of grandnephews, grandnieces who've got a little bit of it, it's a family concern. So you do have to assess those. Now, some of this might be done in the due diligence, but this is one breakdown I've seen quite commonly in order to do that assessment. You know, you're looking at those that are rolling over into the new co, they're not breaking it down between senior management and non-executives. And then there are those that will be quitting, so they'll be taking their money and not coming out. So that, I think you need to sort them that way at first, and then you need to do a risk assessment. Now, if you've got 40 investors, you won't want to get the passports and utility bills for all of those, but you've got to justify why there's a common pattern and why they're low risk and why that's not necessary. And you've got to document that. And I found that that's not understood by all. You do, and everyone understands this point, that if the owner has more than 25%, you have to get their passport and utility bill because they're an ultimate beneficial owner, a UBO, and they're used to that kind of concept. But even investors or sellers where you're paying them money who are below 25%, you have to do some risk assessment and you have to justify why you don't need to get the verification documents. And I find that's not understood by everyone.
Some people might sometimes plead ignorance to say, oh, well, we didn't think we had to do that. But you've really got to say, okay, well, this was our understanding. This was the approach we took. This is why we haven't taken necessary KYC from this person.
Yeah.
There's got to be evidence of that.
And a lot of people think you only have to do it if they're over 25%, but you have to risk assess them all. And other people say to me, is there a threshold? But no, there's no threshold. So you have to identify every investor, and you have to do, and when it says risk assessment, it might just be a sentence about them, and you might be able to group them together. So this is not some huge thing, but you do have to put down in writing some thoughts about who they are and why they're there and why they might be low risk.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks very much. I think there's one more example here, which we don't want to finish on a bad note, but we've got to talk about high risk enhanced due diligence. It is, it's normally the area which firms do come up against, and there's obviously sanctions every year. We've seen Russia this year, we've seen Iran ongoing. So this is really important, isn't it, Andrew?
It is, and I think an example just to tie to the former thing. So if this company had 40 investors and it was based in Russia, maybe you'd have to get verification documents for all the investors. So you'd have to do, whereas if it wasn't based in Russia, you might only have to get verification documents for a handful of them, and you'd argue the others were low risk and it wasn't proportional. So I think that's an example where, it's certain jurisdictions sort of come up high risk and you don't have to do enhanced due diligence.
Andrew, just one of the questions I saw that came through whilst we've been talking. We've had a huge response, which is fantastic. If we don't have time, we'll follow up with some of these people one-to-one. But one of the ones that I just wanted to pick up on, the companies that do not end up getting bought by private equity firms, so transactions, they do due diligence, they don't go ahead with them, are the firms obliged to keep the records of the due diligence they've done on those firms if they don't go ahead with the underlying investment?
I don't think so, no. But, if money doesn't go to those people, then I don't think they're due to keep the records. They are obliged to make a suspicious, a SAR as it's called,
yep,
if they see anything.
If they see something.
But I would say they don't have to keep the records. No.
Okay, fantastic. So to summarise then, some of the points that we've touched upon today, for MLD does provide actually a lot of language, Andrew, around the risk assessment that has to be conducted.
So this is where you have to, this is a common error. So I often see a file where they've got the passports and the utility bills, the name of the portfolio company, but there's no documentation of the risk assessment. So for MLD, made it very clear you have to document risk assessment, so you need that documented. If you haven't documented it, you've just got the verification documents, you'll fail the test on the file. The other part about the risk assessment is that the AML screening checks, such as WorldCheck, they're looking for PEPs, they're looking for high-risk jurisdictions, adverse findings, so they're part of the risk assessment process. Again, you need to keep those to show that you've done an adequate risk assessment. Again, that's not always understood. So yeah, again, you'll see files and it won't have the records of the world checks or the Google searches. So you will fail if you don't have them there. The third thing is this point about the sellers of an unlisted company. They all need to be risk assessed, and then you've got to justify why you don't need the verification documents. And if there are a lot of investors, I mean, the FCA are pragmatic and they understand this proportionality issue here, but there's no threshold. So you have to justify, you know, only getting verification documents for certain investors. You know, you have to explain why you do that and justify it. The FCA are not expecting, there's lots and lots of investors with very small stakes, but the FCA not expecting you to get the verification documents for everyone, but they are expecting you to, you know, explain why that's not proportional and why it's not necessary.
You can't just sleep under the mat expecting that nothing is ever going to come of this. You've got to be prepared to be able to have evidence-based information, and have story to tell is one way of putting it, but that there needs to be a function and a process internally that shows why certain decisions have been taken.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And
I think that last point, actually, we ought to sort of broaden that out. I mean, there's a cyber security risk because you're emailing, you know, PDFs of passports, but the bigger point, actually, is there's a broader point there, thinking about it now, and that is about archiving risk and filing risk. And as I say, I mean, 80% of the cases I've seen, it wasn't that the firm didn't do the KYC directly, they were doing it right, but they hadn't kept the files.
Yeah.
They sent them away to you know, iron out, and they couldn't turn them around within 48 hours. Then the regulator gets suspicious.
Then they're scrambling.
Yeah, then they're scrambling, and then when they do finally find the files, they're incomplete because they've only kept the verification documents and a little bit of background. They haven't kept the risk assessment. They haven't kept the you know, the world check outputs and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah, so that really highlights the use of automated systems and the growing trend, I think, prevalence in using these types of approaches with the current landscape. As I say, we have had a lot of questions. A number of you have asked about whether the slides are going to be available. We're going to follow up afterwards. There will be a recording available of this webinar that will be sent to all of you and made available on our website. Also, I'm spotting a couple of common questions that have come through. A number of people have asked whether the software is available both externally as a SaaS-based offering and also with the help of our personnel. The answer is yes. So the software can be deployed on the client side. It can be deployed with different levels of access for people that are just uploading documents, i.e. counterparties, underlying companies, or the people that are actually doing the heavy lifting, the general counsel, the compliance team, the support staff that are helping with that. So there can be different levels of access that are provided, and this really helps with being able to retrieve some of those documents at a later stage if we say, for example, that someone has left. But there have been an awful lot of questions, which has been fantastic. We haven't had time to go through all of them, but we will respond to everyone that's asked a question one-to-one. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Andrew for joining us today, and for everyone that's dialed in. It's been a tremendous response. Thank you once again. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew and Joe. That was a great webinar. Thank you for your time. Now, I'm just going to leave Joe's contact details on the next page as well. I'm going to leave it on this page. Thank you to all our viewers for joining. We look forward to seeing you next. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions.